So let's look at a few scenarios that show us how permissions might apply. And this teaches us a little bit about the rules of permissions in vCenter under certain very specific conditions. We're going to read the rule here and then talk about how it applies. So in this first scenario, we see that a permission can propagate down the object hierarchy to sub-objects, or it can apply only to an immediate object. So here we have a user, Greg, and we have established two permissions for Greg. One on the training data center and one on a virtual machine called prod03-2. Okay? And on the training data center, we've given Greg the role of read-only, and we have selected propagate down to children. So you would expect that on the data center and any child objects of the data center, Greg has the read-only role. That makes sense to me. Hope it makes sense to you as well. We also note that we have established another permission with the role administrator for the user Greg on prod03-2. Now I can tell you that any permission that we explicitly establish on an object will take priority over any inherited permissions. So in that case, yes, in fact, Greg will have the administrator role on prod03-2 in particular, but for the rest of this inventory, from the data center on down, the read-only role will take precedence. Now, scenario number 2 is also very interesting, and it applies to a unique case when a user is a member of multiple groups and permissions have been established for those groups on the same object. If a user is a member of those groups, the user is assigned the union of privileges assigned to the groups for that object. So what does that mean? Well, first of all, let's look at these permissions. Group 1 says virtual machine power on. We've created a custom role that allows the users that in group 1 to power on virtual machines. Excellent. So group 1 has members Greg and Susan. On the training data center, they can power on all the virtual machines. Group number 2, we have a custom role that says take snapshots. Any members of that same training data center, right? So I have two permissions, different groups. These are groups of users, okay, on the same object. Any users of group 2 can take snapshots, okay? Greg and Carla are members of group 2. So one would think then that Greg, being a member of both groups, Greg can now both power on virtual machines and take snapshots. It's the union of those privileges. So I get the privileges involved with powering on virtual machines from this first permission, and I get the privileges that are involved in taking snapshots from the second permission. And because Greg is a member of both groups, we add them together and Greg can do both. Straightforward, right? Well, maybe not so much. So one day a student asked me, what would happen if group 1 wasn't about powering on virtual machines? Group 1 said, role administrator, all the privileges, right? And group 2 said, role no access. They contradict one another, seemingly. Then what happens with Greg? Right? Group 1 is administrator, group 2 is no access. What happens with Greg? And I had to think about it for a little bit, and I even had to try it myself because I wasn't sure. And ever since that student asked me that question, I've been asking this question to students in my classes. And sure enough, about half of the students would say, Greg is an administrator, and the other half of the students say, Greg gets no access. So I want you to think about it for a second and tell me what your answer would be. Give it a sec. Is Greg get administrator rights or no access at all? Okay, those of you that say Greg gets administrator rights, you are correct. Think about it like this. It's the union of privileges. An administrator role has all of the privileges. A no access role has none of the privileges. What is all of the privileges added to none of the privileges? Well, you still have all of the privileges, right? Now, this is different than Active Directory, because Active Directory says kind of the most restrictive one applies. Well, there's no sense of most restrictive or least restrictive or anything like that. Your privilege either contains a checkbox that it's there or it doesn't. And if it's there, you add the two together and you get that particular privilege or permission. Okay? The union of privileges. Now this is very interesting, but let me just say that this only applies to this particular scenario where I have users that are members of multiple groups and those groups have permissions set up on the same object. And here's our example of that. No administrator, or administrator and no access. Okay, Greg is assigned the union of privileges from both group 1 and group 2. Very good. Now scenario 3 is a little bit different. Scenario 3 is very similar to the first scenario where I had a user that was assigned rights, okay, that were propagated down to child objects and then immediately applied to an object. And now I have a group where I have group 1, Greg and Susan. They get administrator access on the training data center, and those rights have been propagated. But group 2, that's Greg and Carla, have read-only rights to prod 03-1, okay? Because that privilege or that permission has applied directly to an object, it will take precedence over any inherited rights that that user or the members of that group will have, okay? So in this case, Greg and Carla get read-only on prod 03-1. For everything else, well, Carla gets nothing, but Greg and Susan have the administrator role. Finally, we have one other permission, one other rule that says a user or group is given only one role for any particular object. Permissions defined explicitly for a user on an object take precedence over all group permissions on that same object. In other words, if we explicitly assign a permission to Greg that says no access on the training data center, then it doesn't matter whether Greg is a member of any groups, okay? Because we explicitly say Greg, that is the permission that Greg will have. Yes, it happens that Greg is a member of group 1 and group 2, and if this permission didn't exist, Greg would have the union of these privileges. But because we explicitly created a permission that said no access, then Greg has no access. We're picking on poor Greg, but there you go. So when it comes to creating a role, you'll notice that I mentioned a couple of things before. That there are 2 inventory objects that are consistent or that appear in all 4 of those views. It's the vCenter itself and it's the data center. Anything else only appears within a particular view. So if you wanted to create a role for a permission for a user on, for example, a specific cluster, and you wanted a user to be able to create virtual machines on a specific cluster, and that cluster is obviously below the data center, not only would you have to establish the permission in the hosts and clusters view on the cluster, but in order for a user to be able to add that VM to a VMs and templates folder, you'd have to create a permission on the VMs and templates folder. And if you wanted the user to be able to store that virtual machine on a particular data store, you'd have to create a permission on the data store. And if you wanted to be able to add that virtual machine to a particular network, you would have to create a permission for a virtual machine port group in that view as well. So unless you're establishing permissions that propagate from vCenter or the data center on down, make sure that when you're creating the permissions, you do it in all 4 of those views, which is particularly cumbersome in my opinion. But if you need that real granular level of security, then be aware that in order for the user to do the thing that you want them to do, you actually have to create those permissions in multiple places. Right? Not only that, but when you are creating the particular role, you're going to have to go into each of the types of privileges and select those different privileges. Privileges around virtual machines, privileges around provisioning, privileges around assigning resources, and the like. The last thing that we wanted to talk about before we get into the labs here are global permissions. And global permissions came into the product when we established enhanced linked mode. Okay? And global permissions apply to 3 different areas. The first one is your vCenter inventory. Okay? A global permission, think of it as establishing a permission at one level higher than your vCenter. This way, if you have multiple vCenters all in enhanced linked mode, a global permission established for a user or a group would apply to all of the vCenters and their entire objects. The data center under those vCenters, and then the folders and so on below that. Okay? Now we also have content libraries, and content libraries provide a way for us to share templates and ISO images and the like between vCenters. So global permissions also apply to permissions around content libraries because it's not an inventory object, right? It's just at the level of vCenter or higher across vCenters. And then finally, tags as well. If you want to create tags and tag categories, those are established at this global level as well. So that does it for our lesson on permissions. And at this point, we have a couple of labs. In lab number 9, we're going to add vclass.local, which is our Active Directory domain, as an identity source, so that we can then now establish permissions from users and groups in vclass.local in our inventory. So lab 9 is a very quick, let's add vclass.local as an identity source. And in lab number 10, we're actually going to establish some permissions across 5 tasks. Okay? So let's go ahead and do those 2 labs and wind up our lesson on permissions, where we've defined the 3 things that make up a permission: the who, the what, the where, the role, the vCenter object, and the user or group. Okay? We've established some of those roles for applying permissions. We now know how to create a custom role and how to create a permission across the inventory. Okay? When we come back, we'll have a look at backing up and restoring the vCenter appliance. So I hope you'll join us in a few minutes after you've finished those 2 labs. We'll see you real soon.